Once we figured out what the constraints on our speech are, we can actually start thinking about ways that we can find our topic. And this can be a really tricky part of the speech making process, and it can be a really paralyzing part of the speech making process because you come across a sort of choice paralysis almost. It becomes very difficult to say, oh, well, I want to do this topic because it's good for these reasons, and I want to do this topic because of these reasons. And ultimately, you just have to go with your gut, and you have to figure out what it is that you are passionate about and what it is that your audience is going to find interesting. So there's a number of different ways that we can go about finding our speech topic. The first of these is to conduct a personal inventory. And when we conduct a personal inventory, we are looking at a detailed and descriptive list all about you, the speaker. So you have to think about you. You have to think about what is your major? What are your hobbies? What are some extracurricular activities that you do? Do you do any sports? Are you part of any clubs? Do you have any particular skills, unique skills that nobody else knows about? And what sorts of maybe books have you read? Have you ever traveled in your life? There's lots of different things about you that you could potentially write a speech about that your audience would also find really interesting. So start by looking inwards and figuring out who you are and what sorts of things you're interested in. You could also, of course, use what we call finding aids. And finding aids are tools that help you find lists of possible topics. And there's lots of different finding aids that exist in the world. For example, you could look at bestseller lists. You could go to Amazon.com, you could go to the New York Times or any other publisher that puts out a list of the most read books of the day. And the reason that you could look to these bestseller lists is because it tells you what your audience might potentially be interested in. Because the bestseller lists tend to be about, or tend to have books that are about topics that the audience is particularly interested in right now, or that the world is particularly interested in right now, and therefore your audience might be. So you can start by looking at bestseller lists, see what books people are reading. You could also look to a lot of major polling organizations, and for each of these finding aids, your book gives you a list of a bunch of different places that you could potentially look, but literally the job of these polling organizations is to go out into the world and ask people what they are thinking about the topics of the day, what their opinions are. And so you could go to places like Gallup, for example, that's one of the major polling organizations, and see what they have, what data they've collected recently about the quote-unquote topics of the day. You could, of course, also go to various different media outlets. And these could be the evening news. This could be a magazine, hopefully not the ones that you see in the grocery store checkout line. It could be something like the History Channel or National Geographic. It could be talk radio like NPR. But there's lots of different media out there that are talking about current events and that are talking about the things that people are interested in right now. I've gotten a number of different speech ideas for my speech and debate team from places like NPR, from the various different radio shows, like Science Friday, for example, is a really good one for informative speeches. But the media outlets talk about all of these different topics that people are thinking about or that are really interesting and intriguing, and it's a really good place to start your research, to spark something in your mind. Of course, you shouldn't just take a radio broadcast or something from National Geographic or whatever it is and copy it word for word in your speech. You should always do your own research. But each of these is a really great place to start. And of course, the internet is also a really good place to start in finding various different topics that you could use for a speech. In fact, there are lists that exist on the internet that are literally 100 great informative speech topics or 100 great persuasive speech topics or what have you. And those are good places to start, once again, but I would recommend trying to not use the actual topics that are on those lists most of the time. Because chances are, if it's on one of those lists, your audience already has some vague idea about it, and it doesn't really need to necessarily be in a speech. It's something that's been talked about before. We want to look for things that are new and exciting, and so you can use these lists as a jumping off point to help inspire your own speeches. And finally, you can poll your own audience and see what they are interested in when it comes to potential speech topics. Now, a word of caution here is that you should really only poll your audience about potential speech topics once you've narrowed it down to 2 or 3, because your audience is likely going to be interested in a lot of different things, and they are likely going to be doing their speeches about those things that they're interested in. So if someone brings up, oh, this would make a really interesting, informative speech, they might be thinking about doing that speech themselves. So check in with them and make sure that that isn't the case. And as you can see in the picture on this slide, brainstorming is a really great way to come up with a lot of different topics at once. And this should really be the first place that you start. And actually, in today's activity board, you are going to be performing a bit of brainstorming and helping each other out in extrapolating those ideas and coming up with various different speech topics surrounding those ideas. As you can see, there are a lot of ways that you can potentially find your topic. So start here. Start by just making a list. Start by just looking at lists and figure out what you know about, at least a little bit, what you are interested in, and what your audience might be interested in.